Thanks everyone for joining our session on everything you need to know about family-friendly policies. Julie's going to start us off. Julie was giving me a bit of insight into what she's going to cover. And she said she's going to start off by telling you what we're not doing today, what we're definitely not going to be doing today. So pass you over to Julie.
Thanks, Gareth. Morning, everyone. Yep, Gareth's absolutely right. To start off today, I want to clarify what we're not going to be doing. So hopefully you won't all switch your screens off. It's not going to be a run through of the actual rights that employees are due in relation to all the different family-friendly policies. It's not going to look at the amount of leave they have available to them, or the notification requirements that an employee may have to give. The detail of that we can provide to you on a case-by-case basis, but it doesn't make for a very interesting discussion. So instead, what we want to do is focus on family-friendly leave in the workplace more broadly, and advise you generally on how to approach dealing with these types of requests, including looking at cultural shifts and how that may alter the types of leave that you're getting and you may find yourself dealing with, and generally the factors to bear in mind when you're responding. So to begin, I'm going to pass you back to Gareth for a few statistics.
Thanks, Julie. Yeah, we just thought we'd set the scene with a few statistics around the use of different family leave rights, just to set the context of where things are going and where things have been, really. So a few statistics. Shared parental leave. I'm not sure how many people have dealt with shared parental leave, taken shared parental leave, but maybe this statistic will give us a bit of an insight. So currently, statistics show that shared parental leave has a take-up of only around 3 to 4% of eligible parents. And that is despite a government target of a 25% uptake. Now, the Department for Business is evaluating the effectiveness of the scheme. Clearly, it's not meeting the requirements that it was set to meet, or it's not having the impact that maybe it was hoped it would have when it was introduced. And so it seems likely, as a result of that review, that at some point the process will be reformed in some way to encourage more parents to share in the care of a child. Moving on to paternity leave, statistics show that only a third, around 32% of eligible fathers took paternity leave in the last year, with some suggesting perhaps the low uptake on that being down to affordability, and especially given the cost of living crisis. Many people perhaps can't afford a dip in salary even for a couple of weeks, and that's a very serious issue in the current economic climate. In the period from April to June 2021, 3 in 4 mothers were with dependent children, so 75.6%, specific figure, were in work in the UK, which is the highest level in the equivalent quarter over the last 20 years. So clearly we can see lots more people, lots more mothers are in work compared to maybe a generation or so ago, which clearly has an impact on uptake and the relevance of family-friendly leave rights. And a final statistic for you, the number of part-time workers in the UK has increased from 6 million in May 1992 to 8.7 million up to June 2019. Now, this increase equated to about a 45% growth in part-time workers, compared with just an increase of 22.8% in full-time workers during the same period. Now, more recent statistics from March 2020 onwards, and if you just give that date a bit of a thought, you'll realise what it coincides with. The number of part-time workers in the UK has actually fallen off, with the number of full-time workers starting to grow. So in large part, it's believed that that's because the increased use of things like working from home and remote access to working has perhaps removed some of the barriers of working full-time for employees who have family responsibilities. Perhaps where they would have required part-time working in the past, they don't need that. They don't need to leave work early to pick up the kids from school, for example, because it's much easier to do that when they're working from home. They don't need to cut into their hours. Is part of the thinking there. Now, clearly we can see from those statistics that there have been significant shifts in the way we work and in who makes up the UK workforce. all of which require employers to be nimble and to adapt to societal changes. So hopefully those statistics put a bit of context around the topic that we're discussing today. And I'm just going to pass you back to Julie, who's going to get into a bit more of the detail for us.
Yeah, thanks, Gareth. So we want to focus first of all on responding to requests. And before I do that, I just want to run through the various types of family-friendly leave that employers may be required to consider and respond to. So the first one I think we'll all be very familiar with is maternity leave, and that's for women having babies. Forgive me if you think I'm stating the obvious here, but I do just want to kind of describe each type of leave. So that's one that we all are very well aware of, I think. Adoption leave, so that's an individual adopting, that's an employee adopting, and obviously can be a man or a woman who is the principal adopter. And paternity leave, as Gareth has mentioned, that's for a man whose partner has had a baby or is adopting. We also have shared parental leave, and that's where both parents share the leave. And time off for dependents, that's for any employee who has caring responsibilities, but that's one where the leave requested is usually unplanned. It's usually in an emergency, and it's not restricted to caring for children, and it can sadly include the death of a close relative when that happens, particularly unexpectedly. And parental bereavement leave, which is again open obviously to employees who sadly experience the death of a child. And there's also rights for time off work for antenatal care. That's obviously you're pregnant, you're attending appointments or adoption appointments. So that's before you get the child. Employees are still allowed certain types of rights, and there can be unpaid time off taken by the person who is supporting the partner of that pregnant woman or that adopter. So that's just a run through and giving you a flavour of the wide range of family-friendly requests that you might face. So as you all know, there are protections for employees in place against them suffering any detriment or dismissal because they've exercised one of these rights. So this makes following obviously a sound procedure even more important as it reduces the risk of legal challenge by an employee. So, you know, if their perception is that they were supported and encouraged by their employer from the outset, it reduces the chance that they're going to have any concerns about the leave and the impact it's had on their employment. So taking this into account, small steps, I always advise, can make quite a big difference, right down to congratulating an employee on the news of a growing family. I have had clients in the past who, upon giving their happy news, have been met with either a lukewarm or even a negative response by a manager. And what has happened, even though thereafter the employer has generally applied the leave appropriately, it's tainted that working relationship and damaged it permanently. And then any quite small issue that comes up, you know, the employee starts to link it to the fact that, oh, I'm having a baby or I've taken time off or whatever. So it's just really important to know that just from the outset, managers should be trained in responding to that news. And as a kind of as a wider comment, the very nature of this type of leave means that it's often a moment in an employee's life where their personal circumstances and their working life really collide. They're obviously having to come in quite often and explain a huge life event. And sometimes the employee themselves is, for whatever reason, struggling to process that. So it may mean that an employer is revealing intensely emotional details to you, and obviously it goes without saying that the response of the manager and more widely the employer is vitally important. So we've got a few pointers actually that Gav's going to cover, just some factors to consider when responding in the first instance.
Thanks, Julie. Yeah, so just these are by no means the only factors, but they're some of the most most common ones or most important ones as we see it. And we've also kind of wanted to share a few examples that we come across. As you might imagine, we do see it all. So we do see lots of different scenarios where these things can go wrong. So we just wanted to share a few of those with you as well. So various factors to consider when responding in the first instance to requests for family leave, etc. The first is, and Julie sort of touched on this, is that really we need to be dealing with the employee and their request in a sensitive manner. It's not a time for managers to be asking unnecessarily intrusive questions. Obviously, there may be certain pieces of information that need to be known, but it's not necessary to ask personal and intrusive questions. And examples that we've seen, Julie and I were chatting about these. You know, someone says that they're pregnant, and the manager comments, "Oh, I thought you and your husband had split up, or didn't realise you had a partner," or things like that. Or someone announces that they're adopting a child, and people start asking them questions about whether they weren't able to conceive and things like that. Just thoughtless things that people can ask, which can really get things off on the wrong foot, and really are not necessary information for anybody to pass over when they're making requests for leave or informing managers of their circumstances. Instead, really the approach should be to note down the information that you need to get, and promise to kind of follow up with further information to let the employee know how that leave will work going forward. As Julie mentioned as well, requests very, very often involve or come after a pretty big change in an employee's life. And again, at that point, it's really not appropriate for the manager to be overloading employees with demands for information, particularly at an early stage. Relevant information when you need it can be asked for at the time. As the managing of that leave request unfolds, it may not be necessary to grab all the information at the first stage, especially when the employees, as Julie said, is coming to terms with the situation themselves or whatever it might be. Managers should also avoid making assumptions or asking questions about when the employee is planning to come back to work. Things can change often, and it's really not appropriate to be making certain assumptions. I mean, the classic assumption that managers are always guilty of, well, not always, but often guilty of making, which can land them in difficulties, is making assumptions about people wanting to turn to, say, part-time working after returning from maternity leave. It's really not for the managers or the business to make those assumptions. Obviously, if you're asked about that, then you can discuss it, but it's not one to be necessarily making assumptions about and inquiring about, especially at such an early stage. And Julie was talking to me about an example she had with a friend of hers who, when they disclosed to the female boss that they were pregnant, there was comments about, "Oh, well, I thought you were a career girl, but obviously not. Obviously you're going to want to go part-time," and making those kind of detrimental assumptions. It's just not something we should be doing. So clearly, if it's managers that are dealing with those kind of things, they're realistically going to need some training on conducting those sensitive conversations. So in essence, how we summarise the requirements for an employer responding to a request under any family-friendly policy is to be very clear about what's required of the employee going forward without being overly intrusive, as we've said. And that's especially the case in terms of notice periods and documentation that's required. Be very clear about the process, clarify what's going to happen next and how it's going to play out. Certainly be sensitive to those kind of requests and be sensitive to the employee's needs, and clearly ensuring confidentiality of information, any medical information that's shared, any personally sensitive information that really needs to be treated with the utmost confidentiality by any managers to whom it's disclosed. And that does bring us on to a few points regarding how we keep records of these kind of conversations and these requests. And Julie's just going to take us through a few pointers on that.
Yeah. Thanks, Gareth. So there can be actually quite a lot of paperwork involved in processing these types of leave, especially when there's a pay element. So there's maternity pay, adoption pay, and I recently assisted a client with a shared parental leave request, and I've been doing this for 20 years and that's the first time I've done one, so that shows you how infrequent that type of leave seems to come up, and it is very paperwork heavy, but you'll be pleased to know I'm not going to go through all the exciting pieces of paper that you'll have to fill in, all the records. But what I would say is that you should have a clear picture of the relevant documentation from the outset as the employer, as the manager. For instance, you know, you're going to need to get a MAP B1 form for processing a maternity leave employee. And it's normal, it's quite ideal if these are set out either in a policy or some other document that can be accessed by everyone in the business or the organisation. And that not only does it ensure transparency and puts everyone on a clear footing, and it ensures that a manager doesn't look awkward if they keep asking for different types of documentation, it can actually be useful as a guide for the manager to know, right, I need this, now I need to do this, now I need to do that. And then, you know, it obviously reduces mistakes or things being missed when you're gathering the evidence. You should also ensure that you don't require documentation of an employee that's not necessary just because you presume, oh, I'll probably need that. So an example is that it's actually not necessary to have proof of an adoption to process an employee who wants to take adoption leave. But you do need that proof if you're processing adoption pay. So it's quite useful to ensure that you make those distinctions again, so that an employee can never challenge the way you've dealt with it by saying, oh, they've just inundated me for all this additional documentation. I didn't even need to give it to them. I'm just making my life hard and difficult because they didn't want me to take the leave. So you obviously want to avoid that. You should keep minutes of any meetings that you hold with an employee. I know that's totally standard, but just want to remind you of that. But where that can also come up is, rather than minuting a formal meeting, if you've been grabbed in the corridor or, you know, some important piece of information has been passed over to you on an informal basis, should always follow up in writing. And then you've got a clear record of the date that you were told about something, and importantly, the date that you then responded with, that's fine, but I need to have this, or you need to let me know that, whatever it is. So we'd always follow that up in writing. Usefully, emails can be quite a good way of doing that, and then everyone's again on the same page. Don't forget that records relating to such requests can end up being sought by the employee, you know, under a subject access request, and they will ultimately be available to the employee. You'd be surprised what can be churned up under these requests, and quite often people are caught out because, again, they're discussing details of the employee's private life, and obviously that's not appropriate or professional, and ultimately if it gets back to the employee, it can taint or colour the process that they may be complaining about or unhappy about.
Seeing things though, Julie, with like, you know, emails being forwarded on with like all caps, pregnant again, you know, it's like, oh, that gets disclosed in a subject access request, and oh,
Exactly.
no, it was just a statement of fact. It wasn't casting any aspersions, and you're thinking, no, doesn't look good.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. I did have a friend who went back after maternity leave, and she was actually pregnant again, and I think that a few comments were made, shall we say, nothing in writing, but yeah, it can make for tricky conversations, and it's best to just keep keep any records really to the point, essentially. You should also, and this is quite important, keep records of any social events that the employee has been included in during leave. So if they've been invited to the Christmas party, things like that, just to show that, you know, they didn't go on leave and then they were completely forgotten about and they fell off the radar completely. And that can be even more important in relation to relevant work communications and announcements, things like vacancies, or just internal, you know, maybe someone's been promoted and just that person's in the relevant team, just making sure that you remember that that employee still exists. And it also helps when they do come back to work, and you know, they feel that they've been included and ready to kind of hit the ground running a little bit more. And yep, that was it. Vacancies and announcements. Yep. So I think Gareth's going to talk to you about some of the policies that might be useful.
Julie. Thanks, Julie. Yeah, just that last point you make, I think, is really important, because I have seen that in just so many cases where discrimination is alleged, where, you know, you'll see arguments of being overlooked for promotion, and then the business will think, well, she's never applied for a promotion. And actually what it comes down to is, well, I was never told about the opportunity because no one kept in touch with me. And yeah, legally that can cause problems from a discrimination point of view, and culturally, obviously, as well, which is what we're focusing on today. It can be a real issue in terms of making people feel that they're not supported. They don't see a long-term career there. If you're not contributing on a daily basis and you're not part of the team, then it's not good culturally as well. So yeah, that's one that's often overlooked, not by anyone on this call, but by things I've seen in the past. So yeah, just moving on to policies. Clearly, having policies that cover all of these different types of leave and family-friendly rights is really, really important. Policies can give a real flavour of the approach that the company takes, the culture that the employer has, regarding both the detail of the leave and kind of just generally how they approach these kind of things. And on a more basic level, the lack of certain policies and procedures can really undermine any argument that, you know, we're a supportive employer. Great. So where's your family-friendly policies? Oh, we haven't got any of them, but we are. You know, it doesn't necessarily mean you're not, but you can clearly see if you're arguing those kind of things in a tribunal context, for example, a tribunal is going to expect as a minimum that you're going to have these family-friendly policies in place, and that they're being proactively used and kept up to date. So just a brief rundown in terms of what those policies should cover. And I know most people on this call within their businesses, they will have good suites of family-friendly policies, but just to kind of summarize what we want to be covering in those. Clearly, we want to be setting out who is eligible for those requirements, who is eligible, for the different types of leave. So what are the requirements to qualify for the different leaves, and particularly the right to pay during those periods of leave, and where in some organisations we go over and above what may be required under statute, setting all that out to demonstrate who is entitled to what and when. And the same goes for the amount of leave that can be taken and the pay that the employee can expect. Again, particularly in terms of any enhanced element and what you need to do to qualify for that, if there is a qualifying requirement. There also should be clarity around what will happen to other benefits. So what happens to the calculation of holidays and pensions and other bonuses when people are on these periods of leave. How we're going to approach things like keeping in touch days and training events, and some of that additional contact that Julie was making as her last point in terms of making sure people are still included in various events. And it can be useful sometimes to cover that in policies or in our standard letters that we send to employees when we're confirming how their leaves will run. And then also what employees can expect in terms of returning to the business, whether that's to the exact same role or similar roles if things have changed. I'm thinking there in terms of things like maternity leave, where there is potential scope for employers to slightly change employees' roles on their return from additional maternity leave, where, for example, it's no longer reasonably practicable for people to return to their existing role, and just how that will be managed. Really, that's the kind of stuff that can help avoid some difficult conversations, because employees can be made aware of it in advance before, instead of hitting them with a surprise when they return and things have changed and they don't know why. Much better to be very clear about that in our policies. And I'm just going to pass back to Julie, who's going to take us through some key points to consider when conducting any meetings in relation to leave requests and family-friendly policies.
Yeah, thanks, Gareth. So essentially, I think the headline that I would emphasise here is that ensure these types of meetings stay on point. So for instance, a meeting to discuss how an employee would like his or her shared parental leave to work in terms of the weeks that they want to work and how that will affect the team shouldn't be allowed to morph into a flexible meeting request, a flexible working request. And the best way to avoid that really is to invite the employee to any meeting to discuss an aspect of their leave in writing. Again, even if this is an email or something, it doesn't always have to be a formal letter on letterhead, but just to ensure that the parameters of the meeting have been laid out and that both parties are on the same page. And that means that the meeting is likely to be more effective in achieving its aim. And the same would go for any follow-up after a meeting. It's always useful, again, to do this in writing, especially if the employee is required to take any action. So for instance, confirm the date when he or she would like their leave to start. And that obviously helps to avoid deadlines being missed, or any suggestion that you as the employer were not facilitating the employee's right to take the leave. And also in these types of meetings, it's useful face-to-face to discuss any avenue of recourse if the employee wants to query a decision that's been made, or explore further a part of the process, or have any assistance with instigating, again, a related aspect. So for instance, a flexible working request. A meeting is a good place to do it because you have the nuance and body language and more sensitive rather than kind of very bold statements that are in writing or emails. And at any meetings, I think I would say the final point to note that, or keeping in touch days that occur during the leave should be flexible to accommodate childcare, because remember, the employee is actually on leave and that comes first ultimately, and it also shows that it's a supportive caring employer, and that you're really facilitating this type of leave and you're mindful of the employee's lifestyle change that has been obviously brought to bear by the type of leave that has been taken. And I think we want to also look at the issue of pay, and Gareth's going to discuss that.
Thanks, Julie. Yeah, so the issue of pay for certain leaves can be complicated for some employers and for some employees, understanding what they're actually entitled to at different stages of any periods of leave, and for how long, etc. So that again brings me back to the point I was making earlier about how we can effectively use our policy documents to make sure that we are kind of setting it out to help managers, to help employees to understand where their entitlements are. Now, the majority of different types of family-friendly leave, other than time off for dependents, are typically paid, subject to certain conditions being met. So there are qualifying requirements to receive pay, and in some cases that can be complicated simply because employees, for example, in maternity leave cases, will qualify for the leave, but maybe not necessarily for maternity pay and things like that. They have to get their entitlements elsewhere. So the things don't always marry up. So there are these conditions to be aware of, again bringing me back to the point about having very clear policies that can help everyone understand the position. Now, just because those rights are paid doesn't mean that they're necessarily paid at full rates of pay for employees, and the key point here really is to note that things like statutory maternity, paternity, shared parental leave, adoption pay, they're all paid at a reduced, well, for some people it'll be a reduced rate of £156.66 per week in most scenarios. Maternity pay again is a little bit different because for the early part of that the pay rate may be slightly higher, but again we're not necessarily going into the full details of all of that today, but it's just about making those points that it's important to have very clear discussions and be very clear to employees about what their entitlements are. For that reason, as I say, we would include that in related policy documents, often even in contracts of employment, particularly where we are enhancing any rights to pay. Now, it can be quite common for employers to offer enhanced payment terms during different periods of leave. Lots of different reasons. They're not legally bound to do this, but certainly it can be a much more, it can be conducive to a much more family-friendly business culture. It can help with recruitment and retention to support employees, and certainly the trend is moving towards accommodating these where businesses can. Now, where that happens, equally, it can be quite common to tie any enhanced payment to a commitment from the employee to return to the workplace. Many people will be quite common with this regarding things like maternity leave, where it's, I get enhanced pay for a period of time, but I need to return to the business for a period of time. Otherwise, I may be required to pay some or all of that enhanced element back to the business. And again, that's all part of a culture of kind of retention and things like that. So that should all be clear about what's going to happen, because it helps employees to make the right decisions and understand where they stand in terms of their rights with their employer. Now, whenever leave is being taken unpaid, whether it's the entirety of the leave or things like maternity leave, towards the end of that period, there may be a period of unpaid leave when maternity pay stops. It can often be quite a useful thing to do, quite conducive to good employment relations, to allow employees to use periods of annual leave to cover the time taken off before they're faced with a reduction or a reduction in their monthly pay, or a complete stoppage to their pay for a period of time. And that's often quite common, particularly with things like maternity leave, that people may take periods of annual leave at the start of or before their maternity leave kicks in, or at the end, and that can be quite a positive outcome for both business and employee. It's worth bearing that in mind and making sure employees are aware that they have the option to do that. So yeah, that was just a quick run through of some issues to think about regarding pay. I think Julie's just got a couple of final points to make, and then we'll open up to some questions.
Yeah, thanks, Gareth. Essentially, I think the way that family-friendly policies can be used by employers increasingly helps them to attract the best and most diverse talent to their organisations. They say that, it's getting harder and harder to recruit, and one of the ways that you can do that is by having sound and fair family-friendly options for them. It's also a useful way to retain valued staff that you have trained and you obviously have a relationship with and are reliable, and that helps them to stay with your organisation. And I think the key ultimately is to work with the employee, ensure good communication throughout, and focus on that period before the leave commences, so that they feel that they've got a clear picture of what will happen, and that they know that it's been met positively and that they're going to be supported in taking the leave and coming back to the business. So that's really the focus today, and we just wondered if you had any questions or any experiences that you wanted to share with us.
Thanks, Julie. Yeah, if anyone's got any questions, that'd be great. We can have a quick chat through some. That'd be really good.
Just the point you made, Gareth, on the particularly say maternity pay. I know a lot of people would read from small businesses, so we don't tend to offer a lot of enhanced benefits. That kind of offset you said about having people return to the business, I've not come across that before, to be honest.
Okay.
In kind of having a proviso, and we'll pay you enhanced maternity pay if you return to the business. Would that be, can we stipulate anything in that? Would that be like if you must return for like 12 months, or I've just not come across it before? Yeah,
so generally you are free to, because it's an enhanced right, it's not something that you're obliged to give, so you can put terms to it. Typically how you see it usually with a bit of a sliding scale. So it's not necessarily you must stay for 12 months, and for example, and then any time before that you're going to pay it all back. There might be a sort of, for the first 3 months it's 100% repayable, a bit like we might do with like a repayment of training costs and things like that. There's like a sliding scale for it, and it's really about deciding what you think is is going to look reasonable. So employees are going to look at that and think, yeah, that's fair enough. I understand why the business is doing that, and I get that. Versus actually, well, that seems a bit like they're going to tie me down for an unreasonable period in return for what is maybe not that much of an enhancement.
Yeah.
So you've just got to get that balance right. But in theory, yeah, and anything is pretty much open for you to decide as to what you think is suitable in your circumstance. Some businesses don't like doing it at all because they think, well, actually, no, we're going to not reward, but we're doing this because of what the employee's done before. And if their position changes and they can't return to work, we're not necessarily going to punish them, for want of a better phrase, by making them return and repay if they don't. So it just depends on how it fits in your culture, but it is one way of doing it. If you're a smaller business, you've been put off doing it before because there's a big outlay in doing that, and we don't have to. We might lose staff. It can just help cushion the introduction of that for a smaller business, perhaps.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've got anything to add there, Julie, on that point.
Yeah, I mean, I think sometimes in real practical terms, when a business has managed the absence of an employee perhaps for up to a year, and they've been quite generous in terms of pay, and then obviously if that employee then leaves, not only is it a financial outlay, but the plans that they had for reintroducing that person into the business all go up in the air, and then you've got recruitment costs and you're paying an agency worker, so it can get quite expensive and it can be disruptive. So it's just a good way to obviously encourage an employee to come back, and it also, I think, underpins that they're valued. We want you back, we want you to come back and get back to work after you've had the period of leave that you've chosen to take. It's not about bringing people back early or penalizing them for having taken the leave. It's just really to try and smooth out any disruption to the business after accommodating that leave for, as I say, what can be quite a lengthy period of time, especially for a small business. But obviously, again, it's how you do these things and how you communicate it, and that really is key. Rather than coming at it with a very punitive state of mind.
So you could potentially do it, say, on, we would do full 12 months enhanced full pay if you return to the business for 12 months following maternity leave.
Yes.
And maybe try to scale that and tailor a 6 months full pay for return to work for 6 months. It's completely open to interpretation.
Absolutely. I've seen you'll get full pay for the first 3 months and half pay for the final 6 months, for instance. And once upon your return, it's a sliding scale if you leave within 6 months. That kind of thing. I think 12 months could maybe be perhaps too long a period, but again, it depends on the enhancement. So if you've enhanced someone's pay for 3 months and then you're going to reclaim some or part of it for 12 months thereafter, they might think, well, I'll take the chance. So it's all about balance ultimately. Yeah, you can make it work however you want to work. Make it work.
The other thing just to bear in mind on that as well, it kind of goes without saying, but it's useful just to remember, usually those repayment terms are when it's the business making the decision. Sorry, the other way around, when it's the employee that's making the decision. So the employee chooses to resign, maybe move to a competitor or whatever, then you want to reserve the right to claim the money back. If it's the business making them redundant, or it's the business that's making that choice, then you wouldn't usually expect to be right to do it, because it's not the employee wanted to stay, they want to fulfill their side of the bargain, but they haven't been able to. But where it's the employee's fault, like they resign, or maybe they've been dismissed for gross misconduct or something, then maybe you would say, well, on those circumstances, similar, I suppose, if anyone deals with any company commercial type stuff like bad leave, almost kind of idea. It's that sort of thing. So you can tailor all that to whatever circumstances you want to fit. But yeah, often that's what people will do.
Right.
We've got Sophia with a raised hand, very polite. Sophia, thank you.
Yes,
you have a question?
You okay?
Hi
Yeah,
there.
well, it's a bit more advisory really that some advice that I'm looking for. I've
Okay.
basically got a friend that is on maternity leave at the moment, and she's worked at the company for, I think it's about 7 years now. And she's sort of she doesn't know whether she wants to go back fully, but obviously she wants to explore her options. But the last person that was in the position before she was ended up being made redundant because they couldn't offer part-time. So my friend would do the role if it was part-time, but obviously she doesn't think that they're going to be able to accommodate it since the previous person wasn't able to get what they requested either. So I just wonder with that situation, if that was the case and she was to be made redundant, where does my friend stand with like sort of any redundancy rights or anything like that, or payment rights or settlement figures or anything like that, really?
Okay. So there's quite a few bits to that, but I suppose the overarching thing around the part-time request, clearly she's within her rights to exercise the right to make a request for flexible working. Now, we probably know, as looking at things from the HR side, that it's not that difficult for employers to reject those requests. But equally, they've got to go through a correct process and demonstrate that they're given proper consideration to that request. So she can make that request, and she really shouldn't suffer any detriment even if they reject it. So obviously she can test the water with that, and if she does a different role, and if she contributes some, in a different area of the business, then just because they rejected it for one, they shouldn't automatically reject for another. They should still give consideration to that. So that would be the first thing. She absolutely can and has the right to make that request, but that's obviously no guarantee that they'll give her what she's asking for. Now, in terms of the redundancy side, I'm interested how that came about with the other example that your friends referred to, because usually that's not necessarily a redundancy scenario. If a full-time employee asks for part-time working and the business can't accommodate it, then the outcome is that nothing changes. It's not necessarily that there's a redundancy. So maybe there they've tried to offer an alternative there to find a solution.
I think it was something like that, but obviously they said they needed a full-time person for the position, so they weren't able to offer anything less than that at the time. So obviously the lady before my friend did get a payout, so my friend's wondering, would she be eligible for anything if that was to happen to her, basically?
So what I would say on that then is not necessarily, because it sounds like what the business did, they didn't necessarily need to do, because they could have said, well, flexible working request, we've considered it, we can't comply, we can't adhere to it, we can't grant it. So your role continues full time, and then if that individual then can't fulfill that role or doesn't want to, obviously they may have to choose to resign, and that's obviously part of a bigger cultural issue that we talk about, that you lose a lot of mothers to the workplace through that exact scenario. They need changes, the businesses don't accommodate, and then they have to leave. Businesses will lose good talent and all of that. Perhaps what it sounds like happened in that scenario is the business tried to do something over and above what they had to do. So they realized that there would be a parting of the ways, and perhaps they thought, we feel fairer about treating it as a redundancy or a payoff type scenario. So there's no guaranteed right for that individual, but perhaps the business would do the same. Just on a wider point around redundancy, employees who are on family leave, particularly long family leave like maternity leave, they can be made redundant just as anybody else is, and in a sense they need to be treated like anybody else is in terms of consultation and communication. You can't just consult with those that are in the workplace and forget about those on maternity leave. You still have to make sure you're compliant with all of those requirements. There is one particularly interesting quirk which is subject to quite a lot of different case law over the years, where in certain circumstances employees on maternity leave do get an added layer of protection in a redundancy scenario, where in the context of suitable alternative positions, if obviously we know as part of a redundancy exercise, you would be considering whether there are any alternative positions or vacancies that would avoid the need for redundancy. Now, where there are fewer vacant roles than the employees who may be made redundant, and there's a kind of a competitive, well, who's going to get that remaining role, then there is an enhancement that the employee on maternity leave would get, if they want it, would get preference or precedence in getting that vacancy. So it's like an enhanced protection. But that comes after a decision has been made to make their initial role redundant. It's not a kind of a preference in the selection as such. It's more a preference in, right, okay, well, these roles are redundant, and now we are deciding who gets the alternative vacancies in another part of the business, for example. They may get enhancement. And that is quite a complicated area of the law. And there have been a lot of cases about it where that is easy for employers to make a mistake in that area. But it's just worth bearing in mind that there are certain enhanced protections for people on maternity leave in that context. But other than that very niche thing, it's the same. The employee would be at risk of redundancy. They could be made redundant, and therefore their entitlement to things like enhanced redundancy pay would apply in the same way that they do to anyone else. You know, if there's a policy and things like that in place. So yeah, there wouldn't necessarily be any automatic right for that person to get a payoff or get an enhancement or anything like that as such. It doesn't mean the employer won't deal with it that way.
Yeah, so the only point I was going to add in, Sophia, is that I think what you've got to remember as well in relation to redundancy is it indicates that the role is no longer required. So the fact that your friend is doing the job of the person that left, it indicates that the role wasn't redundant. And if your friend's role is still required, but it's just that she can't do it in the current form, and they're probably going to bring someone else to replace her, that indicates, you know, she's not redundant, and so it wouldn't necessarily be the redundancy area that's being considered, and it's more of a kind of deal, as Gareth has said, parting of the ways. Because
we've done something similar in ours where we've sort of agreed to part ways with someone and give them a bit of a settlement figure instead. So I did think that would be the case, and I didn't think she would necessarily be entitled to anything just because she's worked there for X amount of years or whatever. So no, I thank you so much. It's cleared a lot up for me that I can relay back to her.
No worries.
That's great. Thank you. Perfect.
Good. Any more questions while we've got a little bit of time?
Hi, Gareth and Julie. It's Liz from Rota.
Hi, Liz.
Hi, Liz.
Hiya. Yeah, I'm good. Thank you. I got an email from one of the guys off the shop floor yesterday morning. Basically, it says, good morning. I won't be able to come to work today as my partner is not well and I've got to look after my children. Now, ordinarily, we would treat that as a sick unpaid, because obviously he's kind of gone past the cut-off, because we have a cut-off of end of business the previous day for authorised holidays. Should we be treating that in a different way that is obviously more family friendly?
Yeah, I'd say that you're not the only business that would look at that as sickness. But it's really not. It's really not sickness for the employee. They are entitled to that time off,
right?
Because it's time off for dependents, and it's an unpaid right, and it's a leave that's recognised to say that happens to people all the time. It doesn't have to be kids, but typically it is kids. Call from the school, you need to pick your kids up. They've just been poorly or whatever, and scenarios like that. So the reason why it can be important to not call it sickness is that if you do come to trigger certain sickness procedures, it may not necessarily be fair to use time off for dependents as counting towards those kind of scores, because they've exercised a right that they're entitled to exercise. Clearly, if that right becomes abused or it happens too often, that and it starts to be a bit of a, well, hang on, you're not using it for what it's for, then that's a different story. That can be managed. And what I'm thinking about there is, I've certainly had cases before where employees have tried to use that right, but on such a regular basis that it's actually not an emergency scenario. It's just that they don't have proper care arrangements in place. I know that sounds a bit harsh to say that, but it's like, this is for an emergency. It's not to,
Yeah.
you know,
Mhm.
I used to use the grandparents for Fridays, and now they can no longer do it, so I keep taking Fridays off. And it's
Mhm.
not an emergency. It might happen the first time, but then that's just what people have to deal with in terms of making care arrangements. Now,
Okay.
the important thing, just to finish off, Liz, on that, the important thing to remember about time off for dependents is a couple of things. It's unpaid unless you have a policy to the contrary, or you choose to the contrary.
Yeah.
Secondly, it really should only be for a day, 2 days tops. You know, it's a short period. It's while the kids are ill, I've had to deal with it, and then you make some other arrangements. And that might even be taking holiday, paid holiday,
Mhm.
and that might suit everyone. But you don't just keep using time off for dependents for a long rolling period. It's not what it's for, really. There's no hard and fast rule on that, but we typically think about a couple of days tops.
Yeah.
And I usually like to think about, that initial day that you're responding, and then the next day to sort it out, and then by then,
Yeah.
we're going to be asking you to use some other leave.
Yeah,
And that-
the true point of the leave is to allow the employee to kind of gather themselves and put other measures in place, as Gareth said. And you may sometimes, because it's unpaid, agree with the employee that they can retrospectively allocate holidays for that time so that it is paid. But you can then sometimes get into tricky situations where employees are expecting that they're kind of using their holidays, as I say, as an emergency more often than they should be, and just oh, it's okay, I'll just take holidays. So it's all about precedence and being fair, but you can use a degree of discretion. But yeah.
Okay. Okay, great. So obviously we just make an informed decision if it happens once, but then if it continues to happen regularly, then you need to obviously sit down and discuss it.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And if there can be kind of cultural aspects internally in the business about how you treat that kind of thing, and depending on the circumstances, kind of some of the issues we were talking about earlier about the sensitivity and dealing with it, fair enough, it sounds like this is a fairly straightforward scenario. The kid's too ill for school, so they're staying off, they've got a bug or whatever. But sometimes they can be quite serious. Obviously, it could be quite a serious emergency, it could be an accident, things like that, where diving in as the employer and pointing to the rules and saying, what's going on, and it might not be the right time. So you've got to kind of have that difficult balance that we always do as employers, between being kind of adapting to the scenario whilst also being consistent on a wider sense, and that can be a tricky balance to have. But it's
so I mean, obviously in this situation he's saying that his partner's not well, he's got to look after the children, and you can explain to him that obviously we want to be as adaptable and as and as supportive as possible, but then if it was to happen again, you'd say you really do need to look at potentially a backup here. If your partner was to become sick again and you had to look after children, it's just obviously difficult when you're kind of encroaching on their personal life. You don't want to get too, you don't ask too many questions about their partner's illness. You just have to kind of deal with it as and when it comes up, I suppose.
Yeah, I think that's the thing, because I have had clients where this scenario has arisen, and it turns out that the partner who's ill is actually experiencing kind of mental ill health, and it's more than a long term. That person has the flu, and that will only ever be revealed with the passage of time, unless of course they shares it with you. So there's nothing you can do other than keeping your records, keeping a date of when it's happened. And even though it can be a very emotive issue, ultimately you would be having to say to the employee, yes, you might need, they might need to change their working patterns, or they will have to have some other childcare in place. It isn't there for, as Gareth says, routine use. It's emergency, unplanned.
That's it. And there isn't a hard and fast rule in terms of, well, you've used it 3 times now, so that becomes a problem, because it just obviously depends on people's scenarios. And if you know about someone's circumstances, that maybe they don't have any family support, so, and they've got young children that are in, you know, infant school or something, there's going to be 2, 3, whatever. I know from experience, there's going to be a lot of times through that year where there's going to be sickness for a short period of time, and you know it's genuine and that's what it's there for, and maybe they're unpaid, and that's fine. But it's those people that you, when you asked a few questions sensitively, that you find out, well, actually all they're doing is covering for time when they should have pre-planned childcare. That's when you need to start saying, well, actually you're using the wrong leave, and we need to have a conversation about how else we can get through this, again, sensitively. And that may be where I've seen employers then suggest, or trying to suggest, well, do we need to look at flexible work, and do we need to look at changing times and working times to help you deal with that, instead of it being always such a disruptive period of leave? So yeah, it can go in lots of different directions. But back to your question, Liz, yeah, it's not, it shouldn't really go down as sickness. We need to be very clear about what it is.
Yeah. Okay, that's great. Thank you.
Probably got time to squeeze one more in if anyone has one. Otherwise, Becky, yeah.
Oh, you're muted. That's it. No.
Sorry.
That's fine.
Yeah, it was just on the same subject. So obviously in the nature of our business, they do shifts and they can be different every week. If somebody does have time off for dependents, should it always be logged on their record? So for instance, somebody might need some time off, but then they might cover a shift later on in the week to make the hours back. If they do that, would we still need to log that they've had that time off for an emergency?
I guess it depends how you're approaching it. On the one hand, I'd say, yeah, absolutely. If they're booked for a shift and then late in the day, in the same way that Liz described, someone emails, I'm due to start this morning, but I've woken up and the kids are ill, etc. Then yeah, that would certainly be that. But if people are looking in advance at the rota for the week and they're seeing, well, I'm not going to be able to work then, or there can be a bit more advanced notice and they can swap shifts around and things like that, then you might look at that a bit differently. You might think that's just people helping you out by, you know, telling you when they can't work. It really depends how set their hours are or how variable they are. So I'd just probably advocate a more common sense approach. But certainly if it is clear cut, I'm due to be coming in, I'm just letting you know I can't make it because my kids are ill, then that has to get marked down as time off for dependents. Just so you're keeping a record of the use of it and that kind of thing.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
Before about you.
Sorry, I was just going to say the swapping of the shifts helps them because it stops them losing pay, but it's quite disruptive. So you definitely want to be keeping a note of it, even if it means that they've still done their hours, because they're still potentially letting people down and causing, as I say, disruption. It may be something you want to tackle, so you need to have the records there in the future. You want to address it.
Yeah, okay. And this is just for if there's an emergency with people, isn't there? Because we have it where people have had to go home because of pets. Obviously, that doesn't. Is that cost us something different? How do you?
It's time off for dependents, so it's not. Yeah, it's not for pets.
It's probably coming down the track. We'll probably end up having time off for pet care, but I don't think it's not currently a legal right. No.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
I guess as an employer, you might obviously have to deal with that. If people say, well, look, I am going to leave, like, what are you going to do about it? You have to decide how, as a business, you're going to tackle that. Whether you are going to say, no, you can't, or whether you are going to say, well, we don't have to give you this time, but we will, because we're support. If you're not going to get paid for it, we can accommodate it, so we'll allow it. But yeah, it's a good question. Yeah.
I have had it. I've had a client who had an employee who had to take time off to look after a sick cat, and I've also had employees who have become ill themselves following the loss of a pet, and because that obviously can be an issue, but that's certainly not in the time off for dependents, because it's it doesn't. It's not on the list. It's not on the list as of today, anyway.
Maybe one day.
Exactly.
Okay, that was that from me.
Thanks,
Great.
Becky.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for that. Hopefully that was useful. If anyone does have any suggestions or ideas for future topics, we've kind of been running this series on everything you need to know about particular areas, and we've kind of, I suppose, we're wondering which direction to take it next in terms of, are there any more topics to give this treatment to? Would people like to see us cover different things in a different way? So we obviously always want to make it something that's useful and adds value to people that join. So if you do have any suggestions and ideas, I know we have had some in the past, which we'll take a look at as well. But if there's any more, anytime, please just feel free to drop us a line and send us an email. Let us know if there's anything you'd like to see covered, and we'll do our best to do that.
Yep, absolutely.
Okay.
Take care. Have a
Okay,
good
thanks,
day.
everyone.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks
Thank
very
you.
much.
Cheers.
Bye.
Pleasure. Take care. Bye.
Cheers.